So first I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present some results which are really experimental physics. So after the theory talk applied to an experiment, this will be really an experimental physics talk. What I was asked when preparing this presentation is not trying to explain math to mathematicians or to put math in what we do, but really explain the physics that we are doing in my laboratory at Paris Observatory, so actually really close from here, where we can use cold atom physics to perform precision inertial measurements. So what I will do in this talk is that I will explain you rather simply what are the applications of inertial sensors in general. You found them at many places in basic engineering or fundamental physics. Then I will explain you how it works so that you can have at least the main ideas of how we can do inertial measurements with these cold atom experiments. And then finally I will present you some experiments that we perform in the CIRT laboratory. So CIRT is a metrology laboratory. In fact, it's where we have the French atomic clocks and where we realize a big part of the international time scale. So this is a metrology laboratory to build up reference systems, whether for time or for space systems. So I show you some experiments that we are doing in this context. So an inertial sensor, I think you all saw that in your undergraduate lectures. It's an instrument that measures accelerations or rotation of an object with respect to an inertial frame. And they have many applications. The first mostly known application is inertial navigation. When you came to Paris by plane, most probably there was an inertial navigation unit in the plane that you took. And in this inertial navigation unit, there is a set of 3 accelerometers and 3 gyroscopes that integrate the laws of motion. There is a lot of Kalman filtering, by the way, in these systems. And by integrating the laws of motion, you can have autonomous positioning of your craft as a function of time. So this is usually in many mobile devices, planes, submarines, whether strategic or not, or satellites. And if you want to remember a number, in a state-of-the-art inertial navigation system, you have an error of few hundred meters after 1 hour of flight. This is typically what you have in continental planes. So after some time, you need to recalibrate the sensor with an external device, for example, GPS. So this slide shows that cold atom sensors can have some applications in this field. And what is very important in that field is the stability of a sensor. Stability is just a measure of how much a sensor drifts as a function of time. For example, you record as a function of time the acceleration of the craft. Let's say the craft doesn't move, but the sensor gives a signal that drifts. This is what you want to avoid, because if you accumulate in time, this gives an error. So our experiments that we do, they will be good in that field to build up sensors that have low stability. And I will explain what is low stability means. So an experiment that we did about 7 years ago now is to put a cold atom sensor that I will describe later in a plane. And this is a complex machine with many lasers, a lot of ultra-high vacuum parts. But we did a preliminary demonstration that indeed this can be put in a plane. And so with future engineering, we can design a sensor that will really achieve better performance. There was one recent proof, this time not only a proof of principle, but the proof that indeed cold atom sensor can perform better than other technologies by the team in Palaiseau, it's close by Paris, where they put a gravimeter in a boat. And when you navigate on a boat, what you can do is to compare the measurement of gravity obtained by a gravimeter, which measures the acceleration of gravity, to a map. And by matching the two, you can have the position as a function of time. And of course, this depends on the stability of the gravimeter. And they could show that with a cold atom gravimeter, they could improve the accuracy of the gravity measurements, and therefore the stability of the, or if you prefer, the error of navigation. So this is one very big application, inertial navigation, that we will target. There is a second application of inertial sensors, which are for geoscientists. When you talk to a geophysicist, he has a basic tool, which is a gravimeter. He can transport a gravimeter at different places in the world and take continuous acquisitions over many years. This allows, for example, to see changes of gravity after big earthquakes, where you have changes of gravity of the order of typically 10 minus 11 meters per second square. What I show in this plot here is a variation of gravity. So gravity is 9.8 meters per second square, let's say here at Paris. So I subtract the DC part, and the unit is 10 minus 8 meters per second square here as a function of time expressed in days. So 32, there are 2 days here. There are two things in this plot. There are black dots, which are a measurement made by a cold atom gravimeter, and a red line, which is a model of that you can compute from geophysics. And here, when you do the difference, these are the residues. At this stage, you cannot say what is better, if it is the model or if it is the measurement device. So of course, here, what you have to do when you are an experimentalist is that you have to evaluate the inaccuracy of your sensor. So there are various ways to do it. And if you trust very well the model of your device, then you can improve the geophysical model. So here it is really an absolute gravimeter based on cold atoms, and this is with optical corner cubes gravimeter, the state of the art. So we use gravimeters to help geoscientists in their measurements. So this is the case of a gravimeter, which I will explain in more detail how it works in coming minutes. There is another application which is very important for us. Actually, it's applications to fundamental physics. When you have an instrument that measures gravity or accelerations, you can test for the laws of motions. So what you can do is a test of the weak equivalence principle, where you let drop two objects of different composition, and you compare their acceleration in a constant gravitational field. This is, I think, one of the, it's one of the most important principles of physics. And there have been experiments to do tests with microscopic masses, cold atom clouds, at the level of precision of 10 minus 9 in the relative measurement of acceleration. Well, there are other tests, for example, measurements of the fine structure constant. This is the constant that governs the strength of the electromagnetic interaction. So the state-of-the-art measurements are done also with cold atom interferometers. And you can measure as well Newton's constant, the universal constant of gravitation, and state-of-the-art is 10 minus 4 relative accuracy. So by the way, when Cavendish did an experiment in the 18th century, he obtained, as far as I remember, 10 minus 2 relative accuracy. So this is just to show you that 3 centuries later, we have 10 minus 4 relative accuracy. So these are very, very difficult measurements. As soon as you touch to gravity, in general, these are difficult measurements. And last but not least, I kept the latest for the end. There is gravitational wave astronomy. So I think you all know about this, that in 2015, there was the first gravitational wave signal detected by the LIGO and Virgo collaborations on the LIGO detectors in US, where they could see with a laser interferometer the merging of two black holes. So since then, there have been several events detected. And this is a very, very big achievement of experimental physics and also numerical relativity. So I think you all know this, but just I remind, when the two black holes orbit around each other, they come closer, and then at some point, the energy released by a gravitational wave radiation is huge. So this gravitational wave, which are deformation of space-time, they propagate for 1.4 billion years, and then they arrive on the detector and modulate the strain, which is, you can see it as a relative displacement between two mirrors in an optical interferometer, and that's what they detected. So atomic sensors, I will come back later on that in more details, atomic sensors, they can contribute to this field because gravitational wave astronomy, like for optical detectors, you want to probe different parts of a spectrum. In astronomy, you probe the optical domain or XUV or gamma rays. This is the same for gravitational wave astronomy. So LIGO and Virgo, right now, they operate in this frequency corner to detect, let's say, stellar mass black holes, tens of solar mass. There is a project called LISA to go in space to probe this part of the spectrum around 10 millihertz. But in between, there is a lack of current technology, and we proposed that cold atom sensors can go in this frequency band. So now I explain you how it works. So the first slide is the high school version of how it works. I explain how works a gravimeter. Imagine I have a laser like that, which I shine vertically, and I put a mirror on top here. So then the laser is reflected, and this makes a standing wave because of interference. And the standing wave, there are maximum and minima of the intensity, and the distance between the maxima and minima is lambda by 2. So now I take an atom, and I will let him fall in the standing wave. And what I will do, I will record the distance traveled by the atom in the standing wave. What is the distance traveled by the atom? It is gt squared, where t is the time of free fall. And the distance expressed in the number of gradations of this laser ruler is just at squared divided by the wavelength of the laser. So by the way, if you have questions, you can interrupt me, of course. But I think this is still simple. Now I can give some orders of magnitude to see what is the typical sensitivity. Let's say I let fall my atom during few hundred milliseconds, so which correspond to a distance of, let's say, 10 centimeters. The laser, I use visible light, 500 nanometer, and then, you know, I mean, this is classical explanation. After, I will show you it is an interferometer. So when you do an interferometer, you can resolve better than just a fringe. If you did it in practical physics course, you can resolve typically a fringe by 100. You can resolve a fringe by 1 million in LIGO, but so first estimate is a signal-to-noise ratio of 100. So if you plug the numbers, then you can see you have an acceleration sensitivity of 10 minus 7 per meter per second square. So 10 minus 8g, 10 minus 8g, if you remember the plot I showed before with the tides, this is indeed roughly what we do. So this is the classical explanation. I just give a bit of context. So what we do, in fact, is not classical physics. It will be an atom interferometer that we do. And atom interferometer is a part of a more general scheme, which is interference with matter waves, which has been done since the 1960s, where Zimmermann and Mersereau made interfere electrons. Then people made interfere neutrons. Then people made interfere atoms. And that's where we are now. We use atom interferometers. So there are many people working in the field, like about 30 research groups worldwide, to address these applications that I explained. So how does it work? It works like in optical interferometry. When you have an optical interferometer, you have a wave, you split it in two, then the two waves are redirected and they recombine on a beam splitter. This is what we do. So here we have an atom which interacts with two laser beams. So I send two laser beams like that. I pulse them. Let's say I do a pulse of 10 microseconds. And the atom is split in two parts. So these are two momentum states of the atom. After some time t, I do a second pulse so that the two waves will take different paths and they will be recombined at a third pulse. And here I will read off the probability that the atom is in this output state, and this will give me the interference signal. So now I come with a closer view on this process here. This is a basic atomic physics process, which is known as two-photon Raman transition. So as the previous speaker explained, in our atoms we have quantized energy levels. If you take a cesium atom, the one that is used for the definition of time, cesium atom, it has a hyperfine splitting here of about corresponding to an energy of 10 gigahertz. So if you do H times this, you have the energy. And then you have an optical transition here at 852 nanometer. You can send two lasers, and the atom can absorb a photon in this laser and stimulatedly emit a photon in the other laser. If the two lasers are counter-propagating like that, then there is a transfer of momentum from the light to the atom. So this transfer of momentum is depicted, it's going off, it's depicted here. When the atom goes from the orange state to the green state, it absorbs the momentum of the light. This corresponds to a kick or a velocity, a recoil velocity of the order of 1 centimeter per second. So when I do this pulse of light, the two, so you take, it's a one atom phenomenon, the atom is split in two, and the two arms propagate at a relative speed of 1 centimeter per second. And then there is a phase shift imprinted on the atom. So this phase shift is just the phase shift of the light, k times r, where k is 2 pi over lambda, the wave vector of the light. So when I go from orange to green, I get a phase shift, and vice versa if I go from green to orange. And now maybe you remember from your quantum physics lectures, you know maybe the Rabi oscillation, which is when you look at the probability of transition from one level to the other level as a function of the strength of the interaction, or if you prefer, the duration of the pulse. It can go from 0 to 1 and then oscillate. If I stop here, it means that the atom has a probability 1/2 to be in one state and 1/2 to be in the other state. So if I stop here, I do like a beam splitter for matter waves. If I go to the top, I reflect with 100% probability the state from orange to green. So this acts like a mirror. So with these two building blocks, I can have a beam splitter and a mirror, and I can combine them to do my interferometer. So here I do the beam splitter, here the mirror, and here the beam splitter. And now, what about the phase shift? So I would like to explain you the calculation, which is very easy. I explain you that when you go from one state to the other, you pick up the phase shift of the light at the corresponding time. So the phase shift in an interferometer is the phase accumulated along this path minus the phase accumulated along the bottom path. If I follow the top trajectory, the atom comes here, it picks up a phase phi here at time 0, then goes here. Here it picks up a phase minus phi at times t because it goes from green to orange. And then let's say I look in this port, then it picks up a phase phi at times 2t. So this is the phase accumulated by the top wave. If I look at the bottom one, the atom goes straight, it picks up nothing here. Then here it picks up phase at times t, and then nothing here, it goes straight. So then I just subtract the two. I have phi of 0 minus 2 phi at times t plus phi at times 2t. And now if I just say the phase of the laser is k times z of t. Z of t is minus 1/2 gt squared. So when you plug in this very simple expression, you get a phase shift, which is k g t squared. So now what do we measure? We will measure the phase. K is 2 pi over lambda, so we know it very well. This is a laser, so we can stabilize it. And we know t accurately, so we can measure A accurately. So this links with the high school vision I gave you before with this laser ruler. What we do is with an interferometer, we coherently sample the position of the atom in the ruler at 3 different times, and then we get the acceleration. So how do we measure? Here, we measure the probability that the atom is in the two output ports. In practice, we don't do it with one atom. We do it with about 1 million atoms to have more signal. And when we plot this probability as a function of an acceleration, we record interference fringes, and we can fit them to extract the phase. So how does it work? Typically, The previous speaker explained you a bit in general how it works. You need cold atoms. Why you need cold atoms? It's because the sensitivity goes with the square of the time. So you want to interrogate typically with, let's say, a fraction of a second. If you use ambient temperature atoms, they fly away. So you need to cool the atoms at typical speeds of the order of centimeters per second, and this corresponds to microkelvin. So this is a very, in fact, it's a big field of physics, cold atom physics, well known since it started in the 1780s. And we cool atoms by laser cooling. This corresponds to this step. Then we proceed by cycle. We cool, then we do an atom interferometer, and then we detect. And then we repeat this again. We cool, atom interferometer, and detect. And typically we use about 1 million atoms. We have a big laser experiment. It's an atomic physics experiment, so we have lasers with 100 milliwatt power typically. And the typical cycle lasts 1 second. So now I will present you maybe not all these experiments, but at least 2, I hope. The first one is a gravimeter. So this is almost like how it looks like in practice. This is a schematic. So this cloud here, the red ball, is a cloud of cold atoms. It's about 1 millimeter cube, which is trapped by lasers, a combination of lasers and magnetic fields. So the lasers, they exert radiation pressure force on the atoms, and therefore they can cool them. Then we switch off the trap, the atom fall, and we shine laser vertically like that. So this will be the lasers that we pulse at 3 different times. And then the atom fall here, and what we do is, again, we shine some lasers to detect the output state of the atom. So we shine a laser, resonant laser, then the atom scatters photons. We detect these scattered photons with photodiodes, and so we can count the number of atoms in the 2 states. So all these experiments, they are very sensitive. You saw 10⁻8 meters per second square, so they are very sensitive to vibration noise as well. This is why we put these experiments usually on an isolation platform. This is how it would look like in really practice. So these are dimensions in centimeters. So it's an example of a rather big gravimeter, but still transportable. So we could transport it at various places in the world to do international comparisons. So the sensor head is here. And then there is a laser rack with electronics and so on. And this was the signal I showed you before that really resolved tides as a function of time. So when we express, this is a statistical tool I introduced. When we look at the stability of a sensor, we look at how the noise averages down when you increase the measurement time. What you remember from practical course is that if you do n measurements, and if you do it rather well, the error decreases by square root of n if the measurements are uncorrelated. So this is expressed as a so-called Allan deviation, which is basically the RMS noise as a function of time. If it goes well, it goes as 1 over square root of time. And you see that after typically 3 hours of measurements, so 10 to the 4 seconds, the uncertainty is on the order of 10⁻10g. So you can resolve after 3 hours changes of 10⁻10g. In fact, you can do a bit better now. So now the gravimeter, it was the first cold atom sensor that was done. I mean, inertial sensor. It is a rather robust technology, and it is probably progressively being transferred from fundamental research lab to companies. And this is now a commercial product that you can buy. Here we have a company in the southwest of France called Mucons. You can buy the gravimeter. It looks like that. So it's a really miracle of technology that is just catched in this. And these are being sold to geophysical institutes, for example. There is still research to improve the accuracy of the sensor. So now in my lab, we have an accuracy of 3 × 10⁻9g. This is linked to basically imperfections of the laser and the fact that the atoms, they are cold, microkelvin, but not ultra cold, 0 Kelvin. So the atom expand in the beam, and they see a bit the imperfections of the laser. So if you want to do it better, you have to have colder atoms, and that's what we are doing at the moment. So there is a very recent result about that. I have still 15 minutes, right? Or?
Yeah,
okay.
12.
Okay, 12. Yeah, then. So then we also build a gyroscope. So a gyroscope, I will explain you roughly how it works. So this is a fontaine. We have, again, these cold atoms. They are launched vertically and then come down. So I will just skip you a bit the details. Just I show you this. This is a Sagnac interferometer. So when you have an interferometer with an area, physical area, it's 11 centimeters square in our case. It measures rotation rates perpendicular to the area of the interferometer. So by the way, the gyroscope which we have in Paris Observatory, it's 11 centimeters square. So it means it's really a microscopic superposition of momentum states. So it's macroscopic coherent superpositions. And if you say we have a 1 rad per second rotation rate signal, this corresponds to 5 million radian phase shift. In practice, what we do is we measure more Earth's rotation rate, which is 5 × 10⁻⁵ rad per second. This is 200 rad phase shifts. And we want to measure that with 1 millirad uncertainty, so we can do a very accurate test of the Sagnac effect, in fact, with matter waves. So this is, again, how an experiment would look like. Still about the same as before. We have atoms, we launch them, and then we have various laser beams. So I cannot show everything, I think, but just to remember, it's not CERN, but it's not like a toy. It's like human scale experiment where you have one PhD and one postdoc that can work. Okay, I will skip some details because I would like to present you the application to gravitational wave astronomy, which I think is like the hot topic in atom interferometry, and I think it's there is many links, of course, with numerical relativity. So we have a project in France called MIGA. So it's a prototype for gravitational wave detectors with cold atoms. In fact, it's the only prototype that exists up to now, internationally. I mean. So how does it work? I explain a bit. The idea is to measure the changes in laser phase, but not by using two mirrors in a Fabry-Perot cavity or in a Michelson interferometer, but you replace these two mirrors by clouds of cold atoms. I explained you before that the atom interferometer measures changes in laser phase. And what you maybe know is that when a gravitational wave passes, it changes the phase of a laser that propagates from one point to the other. That's what LIGO or Virgo detects. So let's say I have a laser that propagates here and is reflected on a mirror and comes back. There is a phase shift, the phase of this laser minus the phase of this laser, which is imprinted on the wave function of the atom. And it reads like that. So K is, as before, the optical wave vector. L is the length from this point to that point, and X the position of the atom. Delta nu, this, let's say, is a technical detail. You can forget about it for now, is the fact that the laser has some frequency noise, and this frequency noise cannot be distinguished from the gravitational wave. This is why LIGO or Virgo are so complex, let's say, in particular. So what we are interested is in the strain, H. So if you don't understand everything here, what you have to remember is that the gravitational wave modulates the phase shift on this round trip here, and that's what we record by atom interferometry. So this is if we have one atom interferometer. Now we can put two atom interferometers separated by some distance, L. I have my laser, I shine it, and then I measure a phase change here, and a phase change here. What you see from the previous equation is that delta x2 here is the position noise of my mirror. If I now put two sensors that are separated, this position noise is common to the two interferometers. So it cancels from the measurements because, I mean, at least on time scales that are smaller than the light travel time from this to here, which is nanoseconds, the position noise cancels. So this is a very important advantage with respect to optical interferometers, because in optical interferometers, you are directly sensitive to the relative position noise of the two mirrors. And this is a very, very important complexity. In LIGO Virgo, you have to hang the two mirrors with marionettes, with very engineered wires to isolate the seismic noise on the mirror. In an anesotropic interferometer, you are not sensitive to this position noise. And this is a strong science case for developing this. Why? It is because if you want to go to lower frequencies, below 10 Hertz, where LIGO Virgo stopped to work, then you have to engineer a very sophisticated pendulum that isolates at low frequency, and this is very hard. So that's, let's say, this rejection of position noise is one case scientific support for the atom interferometer community. Of course, there are challenges, huge challenges that remain. And one is that here we use atoms to measure the phase of a laser. So the measurement is atoms, and we use typically 1 million atoms. We are limited by the quantum projection noise of the atoms, that's what the previous speaker explained. So it means when you have n atoms, usually you have an error proportional to square root of the number of atoms. This is the shot noise. This is also true for photon interferometers, but in a laser, you have 10 to the 20 photons per second, whereas in an atom interferometer, you have 10 to the 6 atoms per second. So as it goes with square root, we have 14 orders of magnitude, typically. So because it's square root, we have 7 orders of magnitude to win to go to these sensitivities. So this is something that is very tough, and it is a criticism, and we have to work on that to come to that point. So of course, there are quantum metrology techniques to improve on that, but I think it's fair to say that before detecting gravitational wave with atom interferometers, we probably have to wait for 20 years, I would say. But between the 72 Weiss proposal for LIGO and 2015, there was 40 years, so I think we can make it. So that was the plot I showed you at the beginning. What we propose is to use atom interferometer to fill the gap between the LISA space mission and Virgo LIGO, or even advanced laser interferometer like the Einstein telescope. And in this region, there are many astrophysical sources that are very interesting. For example, so-called intermediate mass black holes, which are black holes of 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4 solar mass, which we are not even sure they exist. So this region would allow to probe these intermediate mass black holes and also the in-spiral phase of black holes before they merge. So if you want to have more details, there are many papers, but this one is rather simple to explain what are the sources, for example. So we have a project for that, to do a prototype with many institutes. This will be located here. In the southeast of France, there is the former military control site for the nuclear weapon in France. It was dismantled at the end of the Cold War. And now it's a low noise environment. Low noise because it was built from as far as possible from everything. And we want to install 2 arms in this underground laboratory. So we will dig tunnels, 200 meters long, and place inside these tunnels 3 atom interferometers. So this is schematically how it works. We will have 3 atom interferometers, so we could do it just with 2, but we have shown there are more interest to have more clouds. They will be separated by 100 meters here, 100 meters here. And so with this sensitivity, we cannot detect gravitational waves, but we can do proof of principle demonstrations, which are very important for the field. Also, this is a very good gravity gradiometer. We can record with this device changes of gravity linked to the fact that water can flow. And what I skipped to say is that this site is very interesting from the hydrological point of view. So we can do a prototype gravitational wave detector, but also see how water flows in this reservoir. And this is a very important question in geophysics. So just to give a number, what we can record is typically 1 ton of water at 100 meters. If you have a ton of water that is here, the reservoir empties, the water goes away, we can resolve that. So this is under construction. It will look like that. There is a vacuum tube where a laser is shined here. So the tube, of course, goes all the way. And then we place 3 atomic sensors at different positions, which will record the local gravity acceleration. So this is ongoing. We hope to have the beginning of the digging of the galleries that will start in winter this year, finally. It's a lot of administrative problems. But we hope to install our vacuum tubes in 2020 and to start then the assembly and commissioning of this instrument. Okay. So now I come to a few points of conclusion. I try to convince you that these cold atom interferometers, they have many different applications in different fields of applied science for navigation, geoscience, or fundamental physics, or even gravitational wave astronomy. How they work is that we use free-falling atoms to accurately probe changes over time in the phase of a laser by doing an atom interferometer. And at CIRT, in my lab, we are experts in the metrology of these instruments, so not just doing proof of principle, but really having them to work at state-of-the-art and then transfer them to the industry, for example. And we have various types of experiments. So there are many challenges that remain in this field to improve the sensitivity, the stability, the accuracy, the compactness, the dynamic range. And so all the labs worldwide are working to develop these techniques to make this sensor go from fundamental physics labs to the field. And these challenges are also there for fundamental physics test or gravitational wave applications. And so what is really nice is that it's both fundamental physics and also technology driven for industrial transfer. So it's a very, in fact, a pleasant field to work. So with this, I present you that this is a rather big team. We are 25, on average, 20 people working at Paris Observatory in this group. The head is Franck Pereira dos Santos, and Arnaud Landragin is the head of our laboratory. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.